Welcome back to another episode of Bearcat Chats. And in this episode, we are talking about race and all the different topics that go along with it as a follow up to our Combating Racism blog on binghamton.edu. I'm Jacob Wilkins, and it's a pleasure to be joined by Professor Ann Bailey, students Andrew Rainey, Siena Reynolds, and Yasmine Nartey. They are all, and we didn't plan it this way, guys, philosophy, politics, and law majors. Andrew and Yasmine have just graduated. Sienna is entering her senior year, so congratulations to Andrew and Yasmine, and thanks to all of you for joining us. Let's start with you, and obviously you've done extensive research in your work, but what I want to know is how has the protests and the topic of race, how does that play a role in your everyday life?
Well, I think for me, I teach African and African American history, in particular African American history. And so a lot of the issues that are being raised right now are very much the bread and butter of what I teach. These students, for example, were students in a class I just taught this past spring called the Civil Rights Movement. So we certainly didn't intend for it to have a particular relevance at this time, but it is something that we think is worth, and I'm so happy that they and the other 30-something students in the class thought that it's worth knowing this information, in and out of season. There's no good season or bad season to know this, to have this background that African American history is American history.
And how about you, Andrew?
Similarly as a African American man, I think it plays a significant role in my life. I feel like it's something I always have to keep on the back of my mind and how I interact with others. And I think it really has an influence on my, just how I, interact with the world around me. I have to be mindful of how I'm speaking and how I'm, conducting myself. And it's just something that I feel like I always carry along with me.
A lot of it is for me is trying to recognize biases that I encounter and that I have myself, and trying to recognize maybe if I might be speaking to a person differently based on whatever kind of unconscious biases, and trying to realize that, or even at work, things like that, seeing are all these people being treated exactly the same, or are we running into some biases? And you definitely do all the time. So just trying to work with that, and then seeing the parallels between the class we were taking in the civil rights history, and then really what's going on in our history right now. That's a lot of what's put on my mind.
Yes, as an African American woman, there is a certain extra sense of cautiousness I have to carry, especially when interacting with others. And I also try, and I guess, unfortunately, make it my duty to make sure that I'm not imposing the plights that African American people face every day on others, because I do think the interactions that you have with other people is very important, especially in a very sensitive political climate that we are now. I think it's important to be extra mindful of the way you carry yourself, no matter the color of your skin.
And Professor Bailey, you're nodding your head, and you've written extensively as well about, in addition to protests, the ways that folks on an everyday basis can take action. If you can elaborate on that.
Sure. I think one of the things that we explored in our class, and what I read about, is the fact that there are many ways to participate in a civil rights movement, such as one that we're in the midst of now, only one of which is marching, by the way. If you can march and you're able to, in a socially distant way, in a COVID-related way, in a safe way, then I think that's a good thing. For example, the people who are responsible for the murder and the death of Breonna Taylor, there's been no accountability there yet. And one of the things that you can do, no matter where they are in the country, you don't have to be from Louisville, Kentucky. You can write letters to the DA, you can write letters to the governor. Letter campaigns are very important, calls are very important. Artists in the civil rights movement, as my students will tell you, were very, very active in creating music and art that spoke to the times and that really woke a lot of people up. So you can use your art in wonderful creative ways. Obviously boycotts were used to good effect with the Montgomery bus boycott that Rosa Parks is so well known for, and others are associated with, including Martin Luther King Jr. So, I mean, there are many, many ways to participate. And I think they would agree that we want to encourage people to know that not everybody can participate on the same level in the same way, but you can let your voice be heard. You can, as Sienna said, examine what you do in your organizations, and are your organizations trying to live up to, you know, the model that we think is best. So I'm excited for people to think of in their own creative way, ways that they can participate as citizens.
And just picking up where off of what Professor Bailey said, all of you were nodding your head. Sienna, what resonated with you that you were hearing?
Yes, so just like the concept of having a lot of different kind of ways that you can help and not expecting everybody to help in the same ways. Like I was thinking about those YouTube videos that people put up where all of the ad revenue by just streaming it would go to different Black Lives Matter organizations. And even I went to a virtual event hosted by King Bamba, the Speak In, Sign In, Show Out, if anybody heard of that. And they were doing petition signing throughout the event, and also people put up their own art related to it. I saw some paintings and some poetry. So really just like, you know, like she was saying, there are a lot of different ways to get involved, and like all the different things that you can do to help. I think there's been a lot of different ways to be involved, no matter what it is that you do in particular, you know.
In what ways, Yasmine, have you found you've been able to get involved?
So 2 of my line sisters were actually also in the works of planning a show up and sign out event, which was hosted on Zoom, I believe about 3 weeks ago. And in helping them coordinate that, we were able to get over 200 people to show up, and just whether it was putting their names on petitions or emailing, writing letters, things of that nature. I think that was probably the most impactful thing I've done, considering I do have 2 parents for essential workers, so it's not the most feasible thing for me to just, you know, go outside and protest. Other people are able to do.
I've participated in multiple protests in Brooklyn, New York, one across the Brooklyn Bridge, and also one in my local neighborhood. I also went along with a couple of friends, and we put together these bags that we handed out to protesters, because like everyone has already mentioned, there's just so many ways to get involved. I've participated in donations and signed petitions, and it's just any help or any way to contribute is, you know, significant.
Andrew, to feed off your point, what's the biggest thing you've learned being a part of those protests, or the biggest thing that surprised you?
I think just how much support that we're receiving, you know, as like growing, like seeing things go on in your life, you wonder if anyone really cares about like what's happening to African Americans. And I think seeing so many people get involved and so many people, you know, voicing their, you know, concerns, it was really touching. And I don't want to speak for everyone, but it was touching to me, just seeing that, you know, we are being heard and we are being seen, and that people actually care about how African Americans are being treated in our American society.
Can I say something here? I mean, that was so well said, Andrew. And I'm not that surprised, if I can be honest with you. I'm surprised and not surprised at the level of support. If I just judge from my classes over the years, you know, even today, people will say to me, they just assume that all my students are African American or of African descent. They'll just assume, because I teach, you know, about those subjects, that maybe only those students are interested, and they could never be more wrong. And I think you'll agree, right, that our class was a multiracial class, really almost evenly, you know, really just representation of everybody. And that's been the case for almost every class I've taught in the last number of years. It's only the first few classes about 14 years ago that tended to lean one way versus another. But your generation, you know, wants to do something different. There's no question about it. they want to do something different, and they want to learn this information, and they want to be a part of the solution. So, you know, my hat's off to you.
Professor Bailey, I want to jump in. Why do you think people assume that about your classes?
Well, one, because, you know, and it quite simply because we haven't necessarily thought about African American history, the history of people of African descent as a part of world history or American history, right? We haven't thought about it in a global way. We think it's just like, we still have a residue from the past and the traditional way in which history has been taught, which is much of the last 400 or 500 years. So it's understandable, is that, you know, there's American history, and then there's, you know, because we had to do it after the Civil Rights Movement, there's African American history, you know? So we're more and more coming to terms with the fact that it's all our history, and that it affects all of us. What happens to one part of the body affects the other part of the body. And so we need to be, you know, equally informed. So yes, I think that's why, that's my guess, you know, that there's a sense that maybe only people of African descent might be interested, but they could never be more wrong. Not at all.
Sienna, to go to you, you know, we've heard a lot of people publicly, and frankly, a lot of white people publicly say, I'm ready to have those uncomfortable conversations. Have you experienced people asking questions, being more open to having discussions?
Yeah, I definitely have. Even in a bunch of different places. First of all, I didn't even expect it, but when I came into my work, like in the next few days after everything with protesting and everything started happening, you know, we started having those tough conversations in my workplace, which I honestly caught me off guard, because I just kind of figured, you know, at work you talk about work stuff and like not a lot about what's going on in the world. But we had like a full conversation. We talked about like the historical side of things, and I thought it was really like, I like that it felt multi-sided. Like I wasn't just getting like, oh, this is the way that it is. And because everything, it's history, like there's so many different factors involved. So I thought it was really interesting to be able to have that conversation at work. And then also, even in my fraternity, we've been having a lot of these conversations going on. You know, and there are a lot of white people in my fraternity. Like the way that Binghamton has its fraternities, a little bit racially segregated. I don't think it should be that way, but right now it kind of is. And obviously we don't want to be that way. We're working towards not being like that, but there's a lot of white people in my fraternity, and we've been having those conversations and speaking, especially with like the people of color in our organization, about like, you know, what have been microaggressions, like what has been things that people have found that have been a problem, and like how can we fix this going forward. So I think having those, like an open discussion about that, can be really helpful, especially like a guided discussion. Yeah, I've definitely seen a lot of that.
For me, I really have not been outside since like March, so I really haven't had the opportunity to speak with people about everything that's going on in depth. But what I will say is, the few conversations I've been able to have, I do realize that there is a lot of support. Something else that is, I guess, a harsh reality is the fact that this may not be the last time that we have to go through something like this. And I think that is something that, you know, we just have to come to terms with, unfortunately, because there is, you know, it's one thing to have these uncomfortable conversations and say that changes will come, but then when the changes do come, they are not the things that are being demanded. So, for example, I do see on social media a lot of white actors are stepping down from their roles of playing Black characters, but those are not the things we're asking for. We're asking for the arrest of Breonna Taylor's murderers and the murders of so many other Black people that are being swept under the rug. And unfortunately, that is what the focus and the focal point needs to be, rather than just, you know, saying, oh, we sympathize with you or we want things to get better. Because if this is not the last time we have to go through this, who knows what will happen next.
Nicely put.
And I want to get back to that point with you, Professor, in a moment. But Andrew, I don't want to leave you out of the opportunity if you've had any of these conversations.
I haven't had any conversations with, you know, other people outside of my race. So, you know, I spoke with my family. We've had really, you know, in-depth conversations about what's going on. I spoke with my friends about it. And, you know, everyone agrees that, you know, we have to we have to work together to see change, and everyone has to be a part of that change. And similar to what Yasmine stated, you know, excuse me, like everyone needs to play a role, and that role is, you know, just being involved. And I think it's important that people are involved and people use their platforms and actually make a difference.
And Professor Bailey, the conversation can go in so many different directions. How does it stay focused, or do you want it to stay focused on certain things?
It's a really good question, Jacob. Really, really good question, because, and picking up on what Yasmine is saying, that there are certain types of changes that are, for lack of a better word, cosmetic, but they're important. They're cosmetic and symbolic. And they're important, but they're still going to be only C and D, right? So I do think, I actually found it funny, the whole thing about the, you know, the white actors playing, you know, black characters. What did that remind you of, guys? Did it remind you of something? Did it remind you of something in the past? The minstrel shows, right? I mean, I didn't know that I didn't know that that was happening, you know, because that's a form of minstrelsy, which we have mostly, I think, mostly as a society decided there's not very, you know, it's not very respectful, right? So back in the day when minstrel shows were a thing, you were a white actor, you put on blackface, and you performed as if you were somebody black, and you were essentially making fun of what, you know, what you stereotyped as what a black person was like. So there's a lot of fun and games along with it. And so minstrelsy is a very, very much a problematic part of our past, which we'd like to leave behind there. So I was actually quite surprised to hear that these actors were now saying, oh, we're behind the cartoon character of so-and-so and so-and-so. So it tells you how far we need to go. Like, as far as we've come and we've made lots of progress, it tells you that there's still a sense of, you know, even on those cosmetic symbolic levels, there's a ways to go. So that's one issue. But at the end of the day, it's a systemic issue, right? The racial profiling that that some of us feel, which is so real and a part of our everyday existence, you know, is not going to just go away because a white actor generously, I think, steps down from a role that is really problematic. We have to be looking at those larger issues of policing, education, housing, and so forth, healthcare. And I, like everyone here, I really hope that the attention gets more focused on those things and not so much on the outside symbolic things, because we want things that will change, you know, everyday America.
We've heard about these conversations between families and people of color about the police. You know, how do you handle yourself in an interaction? Can you take me inside, to the extent you're comfortable, what those conversations look like?
For me, I guess, fortunately, I've never had any interactions with police. I guess the furthest it would go was a hello or good morning. So I guess in some ways that makes me more fortunate. So those conversations really haven't come up. But in terms of future conversations, for example, when I get married or when I have kids, you know, I am bringing more Black people into this world. So unfortunately, I feel like it's something that will become cyclical and something that is kind of just inherited. Like, this is how you have to compose yourself when dealing with police until these problems are ameliorated.
Yeah, I haven't had any conversations recently, but growing up, I participated in like a police interaction class, and it would be mostly students of color. And there would be police officers coming in and other people who would speak to us and tell us how to exactly interact with police, to, you know, keep our hands on the wheel if we're pulled over, you know, make sure our hands are out of our pockets. And I think it's unfortunate that kids of color have to be taught this when, you know, these are people who are supposed to be protecting us, you know. And I think as I, you know, grow older, I intend to, you know, teach my kids these same lessons, but I feel like they shouldn't have to be taught. I think we should actually work on our police, and they should be taught how to interact with, you know, people of color instead of teaching people of color how to interact with them.
What's the biggest thing, Andrew, you'd like to see improve, or that you think can improve in police interactions with people of color?
I think I'd really like to see police receive a further or a broader education. I think we should see maybe a law enforcement major, or just more courses where police officers can learn exactly the law and how to effectively, prevent crime instead of just giving them, certain courses or these short trainings that have been proven to be ineffective.
Yes, I also wanted to comment on that in terms of training. So I'm basically dedicating the next 3 years of my life to go to law school. On top of that, I have to take a test, which is extremely difficult in order to practice law in the state of New York, right? That being said, a lot of officers go through trainings which can be as short as 6 weeks. They are trained how to not only use a gun, but use a gun to kill rather than decapitate or, at least get somebody in a place where they can be arrested without resisting, right? And that discrepancy is something that I would like to see be fixed, because it personally just doesn't make sense if somebody has complete control over my life when they are just pulling me over, whether it's a broken tail light or if I was speeding, but I have to go through so much time and so much effort just to be able to kind of fix those laws that are currently in place that are really only affecting people that look like me.
Understood. In our final moments, we'll start with you, Professor Bailey. As we gear up towards the fall, what do you see as the next steps in terms of, or how do you envision what the fall will look like in terms of student activism, and what are you looking to incorporate into your classes?
Well, I can't speak for the students, so I'd love to hear from Sienna. You're the one that's going to be left with us, but they're likely to be students elsewhere at some point, so they'll still be thinking about this, and likely have been still participating in issues. I personally, I will just continue to do what I've always been doing and I enjoy doing, which is talking about the roots of our current crisis, and which really is slavery and the fact that we have not healed those wounds. Slavery meant an almost 250 years of people of African descent contributing to the wealth of the United States. And having done so, when a war was fought, the Civil War, and they also fought in that war and fought for their freedom, they received their freedom, but at the end of the day, there was a 250-year gap between white and Black America, and nothing was done to really close that gap. Absolutely nothing. There was no restitution, there was no reparations, it was just, you're free. And when you think about that, it's quite a miracle that people of African descent have done as well as they have done. When you think about that kind of disparity that existed, and yet they had worked with that for free for 250 years. So we have those disparities that have been closed somewhat, but still are very apparent in our society. And I think the more that every person, not just people of color, but every person in America knows about this historical disparity, the more they will understand why, hopefully it's incumbent upon all of us to try to bridge those gaps, and that we can only do it together. And we really can only do it together. And I think, as I said, I just want to salute this generation, because I think that I tell you this, that you are the ones we've been waiting for. You are, because we needed that fresh, fresh energy to come into the world and say, no, it doesn't have to be this way. It's been this way for 400 years, but it doesn't have to be this way. So I'm thankful that I get to interact with them and share with them and learn from them, teach, but also learn from them as well.
And Sienna, with you coming back for the fall, we can ask you, if you have what your plans are, and how you see things coming together now that students will be socially distanced but in person.
I'm hoping that we come into an environment where people are trying to be more sensitive towards different kinds of people. I mean, I know from what I've heard from, like I said, I'm in Greek life, what I've heard from some of the other orgs, and there's different Instagram pages that have been being made. I think there's one, I don't remember what it's called, but there's an Instagram page where people of color from Instagram talk about like what they've experienced on the Binghamton campus. And so from what I hear that people are doing around, I'm hoping that we're going to come into an environment where people are a lot more conscious of like their behavior, especially towards other people. And hopefully professors will be trying to have these conversations as well. I think this needs to be an ongoing conversation, and I'm excited to help be a part of that.
Well, Professor Bailey, Siena Reynolds, Andrew Rainey, and Yasmine Nartey, thank you so much for this honest and hopefully the first of many dialogues, and wishes for a great summer. And congratulations again to Andrew and Yasmine and Sienna. And Professor Bailey, look forward to seeing and speaking with you in the fall.
Thank you very much, Jacob. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.